5 years ago, he handed her divorce papers in a sterile hospital room, abandoning her to fight cancer alone so he could fund a lavish lifestyle with his 24-year-old mistress. Today, he walked into Cook County Court facing 20 years for fraud. He just didn't know who held the gavel. The beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in room 42012 of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Clara Montgomery, then known as Clara Hayes, lay against the stiff white pillows, her once vibrant auburn hair replaced by a sheer, pale scalp. At 38, a brutal diagnosis of stage 3 breast cancer had stripped away her energy, her career as a formidable corporate litigator, and, finally, her marriage. Thomas Hayes stood at the foot of her bed. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit, his gold Rolex catching a harsh fluorescent light. He looked at his watch, not at his wife. "I have a meeting at 2, Clara," Thomas said, shifting his weight. There was no warmth in his voice, only the irritated tone of a man inconvenienced by a delayed flight. "The doctor said the tumor is shrinking," Clara whispered, her throat dry from the aggressive chemotherapy. She reached a frail hand toward him. "Thomas, I just need you to sit with me for a while." Thomas didn't take her hand. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He dropped it on the rolling tray table that hovered over her lap. The thud echoed in the quiet room. "What is this?" Clara asked, her heart rate spiking on the monitor. "I can't do this anymore, Clara," Thomas said, his jaw set in a hard line. "The sickness, the bills, the constant depressing atmosphere. It's draining me. My business is suffering. I'm suffering. I need a fresh start." Clara stared at the envelope, her trembling fingers pulling out the legal documents. "Petition for dissolution of marriage. You're leaving me." She choked out, tears finally breaking through her exhausted stoicism. "Now, I'm fighting for my life, Thomas. I've already moved my things out of the Gold Coast condo," he continued, completely detached from the devastation pooling in her eyes. "My lawyer, Richard Dawson, will be in touch. Don't try to fight this, Clara. We're broke anyway. The medical bills drained the joint accounts. There's nothing left to split." That was the first lie. Clara wouldn't discover the truth until weeks later. Thomas hadn't been drained by her illness. He had been distracted. Specifically, by a 24-year-old junior marketing executive named Chloe Bennett. Chloe was everything Clara was currently not. Youthful, carefree, and entirely unburdened by the grueling reality of mortality. While Clara was enduring radiation, Thomas was buying Chloe a Mercedes and financing a luxury penthouse under a shell corporation. He had meticulously siphoned their life savings, transferring millions into offshore accounts and hiding them behind a web of corporate jargon, leaving Clara penniless and fighting for her life on state-subsidized healthcare. The day her divorce was finalized, Clara sat in a small, rented apartment, completely bald, weighing barely 100 pounds and staring at a bank balance of $412. Thomas and Chloe had just posted a photo from their honeymoon in the Maldives. But Thomas made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed Clara's illness was a death sentence. He assumed she would fade away quietly, a tragic footnote in his ascending life. He forgot who he married. Before her diagnosis, Clara had been one of the most ruthless, brilliant legal minds in Chicago. She didn't just understand the law, she wielded it like a scalpel. As the poison left her body and the cancer went into remission, a new kind of fire took its place. It wasn't just a will to live. It was a burning, unyielding demand for justice. Clara reclaimed her maiden name, Montgomery. She spent a year rehabilitating her body and mind, taking grueling physical therapy sessions in the morning and poring over legal journals at night. She called in every favor, every connection she had built over her 15-year career. She didn't return to corporate law. Instead, she joined the district attorney's office, prosecuting complex financial crimes. She built a reputation as an ironclad prosecutor who could unravel the most tangled webs of corporate fraud. 3 years later, running on a platform of uncompromising integrity, Clara Montgomery campaigned for a vacant seat on the Cook County Circuit Court. She won by a landslide, while Judge Clara Montgomery was earning a reputation as the strictest, most perceptive judge in the civil division. Thomas Hayes was getting sloppy. The real estate empire he built on stolen money and false promises was built on sand, and the tide was finally coming in. 5 years had passed since the day in the hospital. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 302 swung open, and Thomas Hayes strode in, still wearing a custom suit, though his face carried the bloated, frantic look of a man drowning in debt. Beside him was Chloe, now his legal wife. She wore a designer dress that screamed of new money and clutched a glaringly expensive handbag, looking around the courtroom with a mixture of boredom and disdain. "I don't understand why we have to be here," Chloe complained loudly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "My American Express was declined at Neiman Marcus this morning, Thomas. You said Richard was going to fix the asset freeze." "Keep your voice down," Thomas hissed, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Richard knows what he's doing. This is just a preliminary hearing. We just need the judge to lift the injunction so we can access the Cayman funds. Once the freeze is lifted, we're flying to Dubai." He took their seats at the defense table. Next to them sat Richard Dawson, a high-priced defense attorney known for bullying plaintiffs and manipulating technicalities. On the other side of the aisle sat Simon Reed, the lead litigator representing a coalition of 30 investors whom Thomas had allegedly defrauded out of $15 million. Thomas's company, Apex Holdings, was accused of running a massive Ponzi scheme, falsifying financial records and hiding assets in his wife's name. "We got a bad draw on the judge," Richard muttered to Thomas, flipping through his legal pad. "Judge Peterson had a sudden medical emergency last night. They reassigned our docket this morning to a Judge Montgomery. She's new to this specific district, but word is she's a shark on financial disclosures. We're going to have to play this carefully. Montgomery." Thomas frowned, the name failing to register in his panicked mind. It was a common enough name. He smoothed his tie. "Just get the accounts unfrozen, Richard. If I miss the margin call tomorrow, we lose everything." At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy door behind the bench opened. "All rise!" the bailiff's voice boomed across the cavernous room. "The Circuit Court of Cook County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Clara Montgomery presiding." Thomas stood up, straightening his jacket, pasting on his most charming, persuasive smile, the one he used to disarm bankers and investors. He looked up at the bench. A woman walked up the wooden steps. She was striking. Her dark auburn hair was styled in a sharp, elegant bob. She wore the stark black robes of a judicial officer with an air of absolute authority. Her posture was flawless, her expression completely unreadable. She took her seat, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly down at the defense table. The charming smile slid off Thomas's face like mud off a windshield. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. His knees suddenly gave out, and he hit his chair with a heavy thud before the bailiff even said, "You may be seated." "Thomas?" Chloe whispered, grabbing his arm. "What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas couldn't speak. His throat seized up. He was staring into the ice-cold amber eyes of the woman he had left to die in a hospital room 5 years ago. Clara wasn't dead. She wasn't a broken, penniless victim. She was the absolute authority in the room, and she held his entire future in her manicured hands. "Good morning, counsel." Judge Montgomery's voice rang out. It was calm, measured, and devoid of any personal recognition. We are here today for the matter of Reed et al. v. Apex Holdings, Thomas Hayes, and Chloe Bennett Hayes. Plaintiff has filed an emergency motion to maintain the freezing of all domestic and international assets belonging to the defendants. Let's hear from the plaintiff first. Simon Reed stood up. Thank you, Your Honor. The defense has systematically attempted to wire over $12 million to accounts in non-extradition jurisdictions. We have forensic accounting proving Mr. Hayes has routinely used his wife's personal accounts to shield these stolen funds from creditors. Clara nodded slowly, taking notes. She didn't look at Thomas. The absolute professional detachment was more terrifying to him than if she had screamed at him. Your Honor, if I may. Richard Dawson jumped up, entirely unaware that his client was currently having a silent panic attack. This is a gross overreach. My client is a respected developer. The plaintiff's claims are baseless, and freezing his personal assets and his wife's completely separate, legally protected assets is crippling his ability to run his business. We demand the injunction be lifted immediately. Clara finally shifted her gaze from the attorney to Thomas. The silence in the courtroom stretched tight, like a guitar string about to snap. Thomas felt a cold sweat drenching his back. He wanted to object. He wanted to demand a recusal, but exposing their history on public record meant admitting to the court exactly what kind of man he was and giving the plaintiffs ammunition about his character. Mr. Dawson, Clara began, her voice echoing perfectly through the acoustics of the room, you claim these funds are legally protected and completely separate. But looking over the initial discovery, she paused, flipping open a thick file. I see a pattern of asset transfer that looks remarkably familiar. Moving joint marital or corporate funds into obscure LLCs right before a major financial or personal restructuring. It is a highly specific method of concealment. Thomas swallowed hard. She knew exactly what he did. It was the exact same method he had used to steal her life savings during the divorce. Your Honor, with all due respect, my client has nothing to hide, Richard argued blindly. We will see about that, Clara said, leaning forward. Motion to maintain the asset freeze is granted. Furthermore, considering the flight risk indicated by the attempted offshore wire transfers, I am ordering the immediate surrender of both Mr. Hayes's and Mrs. Bennett Hayes's passports to the bailiff before you leave this room. What? Chloe shrieked, jumping to her feet. You can't do that. We have a non-refundable trip to Dubai. Clara's gavel struck the sound block with a sharp, deafening crack. Mrs. Bennett Hayes, Clara said softly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. In my courtroom you will speak only when spoken to, or you will find yourself occupying a holding cell for contempt. Do you understand? Chloe shrank back, terrified by the sudden, overwhelming aura of the judge. She looked at Thomas for help, but Thomas was paralyzed. Mr. Dawson, Clara continued, I want full, unredacted financial disclosures of every single account tied to Mr. Hayes and his wife on my desk by 8 a.m. Monday. If I find a single dime unaccounted for, I will refer this matter directly to the federal prosecutor's office for criminal indictment. Your Honor, Thomas suddenly croaked, standing up on shaky legs. Please, you have to recuse yourself. You know this isn't fair. You know me. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. Simon Reed looked confused. Richard Dawson looked horrified that his client was speaking out of turn. Clara looked down at him. There was no vengeance in her face, only absolute, terrifying justice. Mr. Hayes, Judge Montgomery said, her voice dropping to a register that sent chills down his spine. I know only what is in the evidentiary record. And right now the record shows a man who believes he can siphon resources from others and walk away without consequences. In this court, there are always consequences. We are adjourned. The 72 hours between Friday's disastrous preliminary hearing and Monday morning's deadline felt like a suffocating vacuum for Thomas Hayes. He spent the weekend locked inside his home office in the Gold Coast penthouse, the blinds drawn, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and fear. His attorney, Richard Dawson, had brought in a team of forensic accountants to scrub the ledgers of Apex Holdings, desperately trying to manufacture a clean financial narrative. But every time they tried to patch a hole, 3 more appeared. The problem with building a financial empire on stolen funds and phantom investments was that it required constant forward momentum. The moment Judge Clara Montgomery froze the accounts, the music stopped, and Thomas was left without a chair. "We need a bridge loan," Thomas said, his voice ragged as he paced the length of the Persian rug on Sunday night. "Call the Vanguard Group. Call Harrison. Tell them it's a temporary liquidity issue." Richard looked up from a mountain of spreadsheets, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. "I've called everyone, Thomas. Word travels fast in this city. The moment Judge Montgomery put the freeze on the record, you became radioactive. Nobody is extending you a dime. And the disclosures, Thomas, these offshore transfers to Chloe's shell companies are glaring. If I submit these tomorrow, Montgomery will hand you over to the feds before lunch." While Thomas was pacing, Chloe Bennett Hayes was packing. Chloe was not the naive, starry-eyed 24-year-old she had been when Thomas first lured her away from her junior marketing desk. 5 years of marriage to a man who lived on a diet of deception had sharpened her instincts. When she heard Richard say the word feds, a cold instinct for self-preservation kicked in. She slipped into the master bathroom, locked the door, and pulled out her burner phone. She didn't call Thomas's lawyers. She called Simon Reed, the lead litigator for the plaintiff suing her husband. By 8 a.m. on Monday, courtroom 302 was packed. Word had leaked through the courthouse grapevine that Judge Montgomery had cornered one of Chicago's most notorious real estate developers. The gallery was filled with the defrauded investors, retired teachers, small business owners, and pension fund managers, all waiting to see if they would ever recover their life savings. Thomas sat at the defense table, his tailored suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. He looked 10 years older than he had on Friday. Beside him, Chloe sat rigidly, wearing dark sunglasses and staring straight ahead. She hadn't spoken to him since Sunday evening. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Clara Montgomery took the bench. She looked exactly as she had on Friday, unbothered, immaculate, and terrifyingly calm. She arranged her files, adjusted her microphone, and looked out over the courtroom. "Good morning," Clara said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "We are back on the record in the matter of Reed et al. v. Apex Holdings. Mr. Dawson, it is past 8 a.m. I assume you have the unredacted financial disclosures I ordered." Richard Dawson stood up, holding a surprisingly thin manila folder. He looked physically ill. "Yes, Your Honor, we have provided the disclosures to the court and to opposing counsel. We maintain that the transfers in question were standard business practices and asset diversification, not an attempt to defraud creditors." Clara opened the folder. She scanned the top pages, her expression completely neutral. For 2 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock and the rustle of paper. Thomas felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He watched Clara's eyes track back and forth across the spreadsheets. Did she see the Cayman accounts? Did she recognize the LLC structures? "Mr. Dawson," Clara finally said, looking up, "these disclosures appear to be incomplete. I see records of domestic accounts and real estate holdings. I do not see the records for the Blue Horizon Trust or the Ascension Group, both entities registered in the British Virgin Islands under Mrs. Bennett Hayes' name." Thomas's blood ran cold. He leaned over to Richard. "How does she know the names of the trusts?" He hissed. "Those weren't in the initial discovery." Richard looked equally panicked. "I didn't give them to her." Before Richard could formulate an objection, Simon Reed stood up from the plaintiff's table. "Your Honor," Simon said, his voice projecting confidently, "the plaintiff has a supplementary filing. Over the weekend, my office was contacted by an individual with intimate first-hand knowledge of Mr. Hayes's financial operations. This individual provided us with the master ledger for Apex Holdings, which details the exact routing numbers, wire transfers, and offshore trust structures used to funnel the plaintiff's $15 million out of the country." Simon walked over to the bailiff and handed over a thick, bound document, then handed a copy to a stunned Richard Dawson. "Objection!" Richard shouted, his face turning purple. "Your Honor, this is an ambush. We have no idea where this document came from, its chain of custody, or if it has been fabricated." "The chain of custody is quite secure, Mr. Dawson," Simon replied smoothly. "The ledger was provided to us directly by your client's wife, Mrs. Chloe Bennett Hayes." Chaos erupted in the courtroom. The gallery gasped. Thomas whipped his head around to stare at Chloe, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and violent betrayal. "You?" Thomas choked out, grabbing her arm. "You gave them the ledger." Chloe ripped her arm away, finally taking off her sunglasses. Her eyes were hard and completely unsympathetic. "You were going to let me go down with you, Thomas. You put the illegal trusts in my name. If anyone was going to prison for fraud, it was going to be me. I made a deal to save myself. Order." Kara's gavel cracked against the block, instantly silencing the room. "Mr. Hayes, release her arm immediately, or I will have you restrained by the bailiffs." Thomas let go, sinking back into his chair, breathing heavily. His empire, his marriage, his freedom, all of it was vaporizing in real time, right in front of the woman he had discarded. "Mr. Reed," Judge Montgomery said, turning her attention back to the plaintiff's attorney, "you state that Mrs. Bennett Hayes provided this ledger. Has she agreed to testify to its authenticity?" "She has, Your Honor," Simon confirmed. "In exchange for full cooperation in recovering the stolen assets, my clients have agreed to drop Mrs. Bennett Hayes from the civil suit." "Your Honor, this is outrageous," Richard Dawson pleaded, desperately trying to salvage a sinking ship. "This violates spousal privilege. A wife cannot be compelled to testify against her husband." Clara looked down at Richard, a masterclass in judicial composure. "Mr. Dawson, you should review your case law before you shout in my courtroom. Spousal privilege applies to confidential communications between spouses. It does not apply to business records, nor does it apply when the spouses are co-conspirators in an ongoing crime, which is known as the crime-fraud exception. Furthermore, Mrs. Bennett Hayes is not being compelled. She has volunteered the information. The objection is overruled." Clara picked up the master ledger provided by Chloe. She spent the next 10 minutes reviewing the routing numbers, the dates, and the corporate structures. Thomas watched her, trapped in a nightmare. He remembered watching her read legal briefs in their old apartment, admiring her brilliant analytical mind. Now that same mind was meticulously dissecting his ruin. "It is fascinating," Clara said quietly, though the microphone picked up every syllable. "The methodology used here to hide these assets is highly sophisticated. It involves creating a web of shell LLCs, transferring funds under the guise of consulting fees, and ultimately moving the capital offshore." She finally looked directly into Thomas's eyes. The chill in the room deepened. "I have seen this exact pattern of financial concealment before," Clara stated, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "It is the hallmark of someone who believes they are the smartest person in the room. Someone who believes that the people they steal, from whether they are investors, business partners, or family members, are simply acceptable collateral damage for their own ambition." But nah, Thomas swallowed hard, tears of pure panic finally stinging his eyes. "Clara, please," he mouthed silently, terrified the microphones would pick it up, yet desperate for mercy. Clara's expression did not soften by a fraction of a millimeter. Given the evidence presented in this ledger, which clearly contradicts the sworn financial disclosures submitted by the defense this morning, I am making the following rulings, Judge Montgomery announced, her voice echoing with finality. First, the emergency injunction freezing all assets of Thomas Hayes and Apex Holdings is converted to a permanent freeze. I am appointing an independent receiver to take immediate control of the company and begin liquidating assets to make the defrauded plaintiffs whole. Oak, a wave of relieved tears and quiet cheers broke out among the investors in the gallery. Second, Clara continued, raising her voice slightly to cut through the noise. Mr. Marf Dawson, your client submitted a sworn affidavit to this court at 8 a.m. claiming full disclosure, while intentionally withholding knowledge of offshore accounts totaling over $12 million. That is perjury. It is also a direct violation of this court's order. Thomas stood up, his hands shaking violently. Your Honor, I didn't know. Richard handled the paperwork. I'm just a developer. Sit down, Mr. Hayes, Clara commanded. Ignorance is not a defense, especially when your signature is on the sworn affidavit. Furthermore, the routing of these funds across international borders to evade creditors constitutes federal wire fraud and money laundering. Chloe sat back in her chair, a smug, relieved smile playing on her lips. She had done it. She had thrown Thomas to the wolves and walked away clean. Mrs. Bennet Hayes, Clara said, turning her sharp gaze to Chloe. The smile instantly vanished from Chloe's face. Your Honor? Chloe asked, her voice trembling. You may have negotiated immunity from the plaintiffs in this civil lawsuit, Clara said, her tone surgically precise. However, this court does not grant criminal immunity. You admitted on the record mere moments ago that you were fully aware these trusts were established in your name to hide stolen funds. You knowingly possessed and facilitated the transfer of illicit capital. Chloe's jaw dropped. But I gave them the ledger. I helped. You attempted to mitigate your liability only after your assets were frozen. Clara corrected her coldly. A civil settlement does not absolve you of federal crimes. Clara looked out at the back of the courtroom and gave a brief nod. The heavy oak doors swung open. Two men in dark suits with badges clipped to their belts walked down the center aisle, followed by two uniformed Cook County Sheriff's deputies. Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Bennet Hayes, Judge Montgomery said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. Based on the evidence of perjury, contempt of court, and overwhelming evidence of federal financial crimes, I am holding you both without bail. I have already forwarded the unredacted ledgers to the United States Attorney's Office, who have secured federal warrants for your arrest. No, Thomas screamed as the deputies grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists. Clara, you can't do this. We were married. You owe me. Clara stood up from the bench, gathering her robes. She looked down at the man who had left her to die, the man who had stripped her of her dignity, her money, and her future, only to find that she had rebuilt all three into a fortress he could not breach. I owe you nothing, Mr. Hayes, Clara said softly, looking at him one last time. Except justice, and today paid in full. She struck the gavel one final time. Court is adjourned. Asked. Judge Clara Montgomery turned and walked through the private doors to her chambers, leaving Thomas and Chloe screaming at each other as they were dragged out of the courtroom in chains. Wow, what an incredible true story of karma and justice. If you were captivated by Judge Montgomery's brilliant comeback and want more thrilling real-life drama and courtroom twists, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves a good tale of revenge served cold. and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next unbelievable video. See you next time.